Autumn is finally here, and so I grabbed my camera and headed out to my local forest on the search for mushrooms to photograph. Within just a few minutes of my walk, I came across this gathering of mushrooms growing at the base of this tree. I decided to first focus on this small cluster here, as they were separate from the rest, which made it easier to isolate. I began by very carefully moving some of the sticks and leaves out of the way just to clean up the shot a bit. I try not to do this too much, but sometimes, as you can see here, some of the sticks do get tangled up and clutter the scene a bit too much to make for a nice photo. After doing that, I set up my camera on this small flexible tripod to get a really low angle just to feel at level with the mushrooms. And after a minute or so of messing around with angles, I came out with this composition that I was really pleased with. After that photo, I decided to switch to a wide angle lens and take a few more photos of the same group as well as the other groups to the side, and get a couple of really low angles like I was doing here as an example, using the wide angle lens to capture some more of the forest in the background. While taking some of those photos, I noticed that there was a few Mycena mushrooms growing out of this mossy piece of wood, and after a bit of careful messing around, discovered that this piece of wood was loose and I could quite easily pick it up and move it, and so I moved it to allow me to isolate the subjects a little bit more and have less clutter in the background. I again got a nice low angle to feel at level with the mushrooms, and decided to focus on this group of 3 here as they stood out and were more interesting than the rest of the scene. I also used the light in the background for a nice background effect. Of course, as soon as I was done taking this photo, I put the wood back exactly how I found it, leaving everything undisturbed. And just as I was about to get up and leave to look for new locations, I realised there was a third species of mushroom growing out of the leaf litter down here. I gently moved a couple of leaves out the way just to clear up the scene a little bit, and yet again got a low angle as close as I possibly could to capture some detail of the mushroom. Later, after a few minutes of walking down this footpath, some blue caught my eye and I realised it was these Stropharia mushrooms. Most of them were in a bit of a poor condition or were too aged and had lost their colour already, but I spent a while here searching through the bracken and long grass, trying to see if there was any that would make for a nice photo. And after a while I stumbled across this younger one here that had a perfectly blue colour to it still and really stood out. It was also in a slightly darker area, which meant that the blue would stand out more against the background. I also took my phone with the torch on to add a little bit more light to the mushroom to really bring out that blue colour. I then continued my walk further along the footpath, carefully searching through bracken and leaves to see what else I could find. And it wasn't long before I stumbled upon this trio of mushrooms growing in the long grass just to the side of the footpath. I very gently moved a few blades of grass out the way, making sure not to disturb the mushrooms as they had a few droplets of water on that I thought would really make for a nice photo, and I didn't want to ruin this by disturbing them too much. On the same footpath just a few metres further down, there was another species of mushroom, again growing on the embankment to the side of the path. This one was a very vibrant orange colour and was leaning against this really dark backdrop that made for a really clear, crisp photo that I was pleased with. I came across these larger mushrooms growing out of the grass a bit further down the footpath. Again, using the 90mm macro lens, took a couple of close-up photos of these first, this time in landscape orientation. And then decided to again experiment with my wide-angle lens to see if I could capture a bit more of the scenery in the background here. I had also noticed while photographing these that there was a small white mushroom growing out of the grass just to the side of them. And so I carefully moved a few blades of grass and leaves out of the shot and used my macro lens to get a close-up photo through the grass. After those finds and photographs, I moved on to this area of ancient oak trees, which is usually perfect for mushrooms at this time of the year due to all of the old rotting wood, as well as the beautiful scenery of the oaks themselves. And it wasn't long before I found this loose piece of wood with a couple of sulphur tuft mushrooms growing out of it. Because it was loose, I was easily able to put this in a position that allowed for me to get a really nice photo from beneath the mushrooms to capture the gills and the underside details clearly. Now, one of the most interesting things about these sulphur tuft mushrooms is if you shine a UV light at them, the gills, and sometimes the stem and cap as well, will fluoresce this bright green colour. And so I then took the same photo again, this time shining the UV torch at them. Not far from that loose piece of wood, there was a lot more sulphur tufts growing all over all of this fallen, rotting wood here. This time I decided to take the wide angle lens first and take a few photos of the different clusters to see what I could get with it. I first focused on this large group here and tried to capture them all in a single shot. Before moving on to yet another large group here that was a bit more layered in height, which allowed for a few different photos. And then these two groups here growing side by side between fallen pieces of wood that made for quite an interesting scene. And to the side of these sulphur tufts on another piece of wood were these ink cap mushrooms, so I took a couple photos of these with the wide angle lens also. And then while photographing those, realised that there was a few more possibly different species of ink caps growing here that were much more aged and made for quite an interesting photo. I didn't take a photo of these with the wide angle, but I did switch back to my macro lens and had to move the camera further away for this, but got a really detailed photo of them. After that, I switched to my macro lens for the same sulphur tufts I'd already photographed with the wide angle. This lens, however, allowed me to photograph some of the smaller groups and individual mushrooms, starting with this small cluster of 3 growing on the back of this piece of wood. I also pulled out the UV torch again to photograph these. And then moved on to another smaller group a bit further down the log. I singled these out because they were a bit higher up, which allowed me to get the camera below to capture some of the underside details too. And after that, took another photo of this group in between the 2 logs like I had before, this time with the 90mm lens allowing me to take a slightly different scene. After spending a long time in this area photographing these sulphur tufts, I eventually decided to move on and try another location. And it wasn't long in this new location before I found even more mushrooms to photograph. Starting with these, I decided to focus on this one in the middle here as it was standing out a bit more. I took a photo of the wide angle first, as I wasn't sure if I'd even be able to photograph it with the macro lens. After a while of trial and error, I eventually got the camera in a position to allow me to use the macro lens too, and I think this made for an interesting comparison between the wide angle and 90mm lens on the same subject. I then continued my walk a little bit further into this area of trees and bracken to see what else I could find, and shortly came across this single mushroom growing out of a piece of wood along by the footpath. I also noticed that there was a fly resting on top of it, so very quickly took a photo with the macro lens to try and capture this before it flew off. I then also tried photographing it with the wide angle lens to capture some of the trees in the background. I wasn't too pleased with how this turned out, but I'll still keep it in anyway, as it's not terrible. Following that location, I then moved over towards these birch trees here in the hopes of finding some amanitas, and it wasn't long before I found this small Amanita muscaria growing at the base of this tree. I first took a photo with the macro lens. Before switching to the wide angle lens to allow me to capture more of the scenery of the tree itself as well as the trees in the background. I then decided to take a couple more photos with the wide angle lens, but from the other side, capturing more of the stem leaning against the tree itself. I also found this amanita growing out of some long grass that had had almost all of its white spots removed, most likely by heavy rain the day before. It wasn't the best scene, but I still took a couple of photos anyway. And just along from that, also growing out of this grassy area here, there was a couple of other amanita species growing in this group. They didn't make for a very good photo either, but I still tried my best. Further along the footpath, just as I was moving on to a new location, I found this small group of mushrooms here. They were quite tricky to photograph, but I eventually got something. After a pretty successful day out in the forest, I decided to move for the rest of my walk towards a more grassland location in the hopes of finding a couple of early autumn wax caps. As I was heading to that location, I came across another cluster of Hypholoma species growing out of this tree stump. Using the wide angle lens, I took a single shot looking up with the trees in the background first. And then took that same shot, shining a UV torch at it to capture some of that fluorescence once again. I then tried taking a landscape photo through some of the leaves and nettles using the macro lens, and I think this one really came out as the best photo of this subject. And after that, I was finally at the small grassland habitat that I came for. Sadly, there wasn't much in terms of wax caps yet, but I did find this small orange mushroom growing out of the grass that I was able to get a decent photo of after a little bit of trial and error. And the only wax cap I did find was this single snowy wax cap. I do love finding these as they are really interesting, especially when you can see the gills as clearly as you can here, and they stand out so clearly against the greens of grass and moss with that vibrant white colour to them. After that final find, I decided it was time to call it a day. It was quite a successful day for the beginning of autumn, and there's plenty more to come from, so if you enjoyed, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and stick around for more.